I am just delighted on our new podcast of Ground Truths to welcome Seth Berkley. Seth has been a major force in vaccines around the world, and he has a new book called Fair Doses, which we're going to be discussing today. And if you have questions, you can put them in the message as we go forward, and we're going to get right into it. Seth is a noted physician epidemiologist who has been so active in these international public-private partnerships with the AIDS vaccine and then 12 years of Gavi. And in this new book, he describes the story, which I guess we'll start back at Davos, January 2020. You're in the Hard Rock. Is it a bar? The cafe?
Bar. It's a
The
bar.
bar.
As all these stories start in the bar, it has to.
Yeah. This is an incredible story. One that would really be, in the archives of just beyond belief in medicine. So it's January 2020. Most people haven't even acknowledged that there's a pandemic.
Right.
And you're making some big plans. Tell us about what was going on then.
Well, it was a funny time because it was a few weeks after we heard about what was going on in Wuhan, and initially it was thought to be a transmission from a wet market, to people. There wasn't any well documented evidence of person to person transmission, although of course we were beginning to hear rumors of that going on, and of course that's what gets you nervous if you're a public health person. And so the question we had at that moment was, is this the big one, or is this just a dress rehearsal for the big one? And Richard Hatchett, who runs CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, myself and my wife, Cynthia, who's also a physician, were sitting there and having that discussion. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was down the street saying, oh yeah, some case came to the U.S., but don't worry about it. There's no problem. It's not going anywhere. We got it completely under control. The system's great, nothing. And we were not sure about that at that moment. And so really the question was, how do you begin to scale up? And we had at that point no mandate, no money, and no people. Of course, Gavi was a large operation providing vaccines to more than 50% of the world's children. But the board was quite clear that we couldn't take money away from that to do this new work. Richard had money for epidemic vaccine production, so he right away was able to make some grants, including the first grant to Moderna for their clinical lot. And so this was really, we basically sat around and proverbially writing it out on a napkin on what it would look like. And after Davos, I went back and met with all of the partners of the alliance, and he went back and began to scale up. And that really was the launch of COVAX, which is ultimately the largest and fastest rollout of vaccine in history, although it had all kinds of problems. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to document that, both the good and bads, because if you don't follow history, you're doomed to repeat it. So that's a little bit of a start.
It's just incredible, the insight that you all had and the partners like Richard Hatchett at CEPI and others that you brought together so early, months before people started to realize that this was a real deal, major pandemic. And it's extraordinary because what this led to, I think a lot of people don't know this, Seth. This led to as you said, the fastest, but we're talking about 39 days after the very first vaccine, and it's in Ghana with COVAX, and it led to
It
two.
actually isn't in Ghana. Sorry,
Oh,
the 39 days, it was in India. And the reason was because India's regulatory authority had already approved it, but WHO hadn't pre-qualified it. And that's a requirement for us for countries that have weaker systems. So it was another 43 days after that
okay.
before it hit Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And we felt bad about that because we had vaccine doses ready to go. And that's one of the lessons, is how do we get faster approvals moving forward? But after that launch in Africa, another 42 days after that, we were in 100 countries. So this was fast rollout.
Yeah, what we're talking about, just so everybody knows, 2 billion doses by the end of 2024, 146 countries, 2.7 million lives saved, from this effort. And as you say, 39 days to get it to India, where most of the people in the US hadn't even gotten into the vaccine startup, and
Right.
you already are expanding around the world. This is just momentous, extraordinary acceleration of, and I think the whole idea, if I recall from the book, about this, no one is safe until everyone is safe. This is the vaccinate the world. People weren't thinking about this. And then it brings in all the obstacles because you were dealing with the incredible obstacles of hoarding and nationalism, politics, misinformation. Tell us about the real. These are serious obstacles. It's actually kind of amazing how you did this, considering all the things, the forces against this whole COVAX movement.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing was, of course, without any money, we couldn't do anything. So we had to begin to fundraise, and there's a delay from the time you actually get a promise of money till the time you get it. So we ultimately raised $12.5 billion for this. But as we got to the end of 2020, for example, we had commitments of about $2 billion, but we only had $400 million in the bank. So we were living from, one grant to another to be able to make agreements with pharmaceutical companies to put orders in place and also to begin to do technology transfer. So the original idea wasn't vaccinate the whole world. It was hard during that moment. Everybody was panicked. The original idea was to cover the high risk populations across the world because we understood from a vaccine nationalism point of view, it's every leader's job to vaccinate their population. So, it made sense for countries to say, I want vaccines for us first. But the question is, did they need to cover everybody in the country or could they cover their high risk? And then could we cover other high risk? And for example, I think physicians, nurses, healthcare workers around the world needed to be covered because they were the front lines and the heroes of this in terms of doing it. So that's what we were trying to do. The challenge was not even that people were vaccinating, but when countries begin to buy up doses, they
Yeah.
said, we don't know if any of these vaccines are going to work or which one. So the wealthy countries didn't buy one vaccine. They bought 5, 6, 7 vaccines.
Yeah.
And so at the end, it was very difficult to get access. And that's why it was important at the same time to put orders in was to begin to do technology transfers to scale up manufacturing in developing country manufacturers, to work with contract manufacturing organizations, et cetera, to try to get as much vaccine produced as possible. And by the way, extraordinary outcome, 327 days. And we originally were talking about much longer time periods. You covered this in your book, Super Agers. When you talk about vaccines, the previous fastest vaccine was 4 years. We said maybe we can do it in, 2 years, 18 months. 327 days was extraordinary.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously, we can even do better now because we now have tools like mRNA, although there is a movement to move away from this, which is, I think one of the, really terrible things that are happening now because you want these tools in your armamentarium for it is evolutionarily certain we will have new epidemics and pandemics.
Yeah, we're going to get into the mRNA problem that you're bringing up, which is serious um, with the current administration. But before I do that, this framing this, there was two levels of your visionary work here. One was the fact that people didn't even know it was a pandemic yet; they didn't acknowledge it, and the other is, as you mentioned, mumps was the fastest vaccine, 4 years. And the average vaccine is at least 8 to 10 years. And
Yep.
the success rate for vaccines is 7%. So you were basically gearing up. Somehow, this, 327 days from the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to actually having big randomized placebo-controlled trials finished and, a regulatory clearance to give the vaccine. I mean, this is unprecedented and still, I think, stands as one of the most extraordinary medical triumphs in history. But you didn't know that it was going to go that fast.
We had no idea. And in fact, you and I had a podcast together where we talked about these things, during this time period. And, the other thing about it is, and this is an important lesson that comes out of the book, is people don't like to talk about risk. And in a pandemic, you have to do things at risk. So, we did see in the US, I mean, I think probably President Trump's, greatest accomplishment in the first term was his, Operation Warp Speed and opening up the US Treasury to say, we'll take that risk. And that's a big treasury and they can do that. For us, we were taking money. We, of course, were transparent with the donors, but we were taking money and investing in things that we had no idea whether they were going to work. So imagine my head would have been on a stake if we had invested billions and billions of dollars in products that ultimately didn't work. And people would say, oh my God, what's happening? And even the same thing happened on the wastage side, which we talk a lot about in the book. Reporters were looking for evidence of wastage. And the truth is there was wastage everywhere, particularly because of the many different types of vaccines countries were developing. But nobody wanted to talk about that because they were worried about the opposition leaders saying, look at all the money that, so-and-so wasted. And so it was like kind of the dirty secret. Switzerland ultimately published its numbers, which I put in the book, and that was, enlightening. But I said to the G7, G20 leaders, it would help enormously if you would just admit that there's wastage, because in a pandemic, you don't want to go short. You want to go long. You want to have extra doses of vaccine. And obviously, you don't want to waste anything if you can help it, but you don't want to be short. So we were also in this situation where donors were desperate to not have us waste a single dose. And we ended up having very low wastage, much less actually than we predicted. But this was also one of the processes that had to be worked through during this period.
Yeah, and before moving away to the broader picture, you actually had other obstacles we haven't touched on yet. Like, for example, I think it was over 500 million doses in India that there was a massive supply disruption. You had to deal with the cold chain issues of storage of things like mRNA vaccines. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So, in a sense, we were lucky because we had worked very hard to build up the immunization system before this. So, we had built 65,000 new cold chain points. And a lot of it was modern, environmentally sound, solar based cold chain for countries that didn't have, strong electricity systems, et cetera. So, and we were, of course, vaccines are the most widely distributed health intervention. We went from the 1970s, and I cover this in the book because there's also a story about vaccine equity. Less than 5% of people in the world got even a single dose of vaccines, much less all the ones that were available there. And you fast forward to right before the pandemic, it was around 91% were plugged into the routine system and got at least one dose through that. So that meant there were health workers, there were cold chain points, there were supply chains. And what's extraordinary is during the pandemic, routine vaccines went down in 2020 about 4%, and then 2021 another 1%. And that was terrible because it puts at risk the traditional diseases and children's lives. But if you think about it, those health workers delivered 3 times the number of doses they had ever done in
Right.
history. And if you said to me, we're gonna do this, I would have thought that the drop would have been much higher. So they continued the routine vaccines, plus they brought these new vaccines and delivered them to the elderly and to healthcare workers and to people with comorbidities. On the cold chain stuff, we of course didn't have ultra cold chain. The only time we used ultra cold chain before was in Ebola. The Ebola vaccine needed to be an ultra cold chain, and we worked through how to do that and how to do it in transit, to have carriers, and because we had to use it in DRC and the tropics and places way off the grid, but not to the scale ultimately we wanted. So it would have been better for us to roll out traditional vaccines and traditional cold chain, 2 to 8 degrees, regular refrigerators. But, people wanted mRNA because that was what, the US and other countries were using. And so we did our best. And ultimately, that became the most the vaccine we distributed the most were mRNA vaccines, which meant we had to all of a sudden scramble and build ultra cold chain around the world. So there were lots of logistics problems like that. The Pfizer vaccine used a non-standard syringe size, so we had to find people to produce tens of millions, hundreds of millions of those size of auto disabled syringes because we didn't want people to get infected. So it really is a story of money, political will, logistics, and all of that. The India story, I'm not going to go into detail, but, it was very hard because what happened was India, because they had doses and WHO hadn't pre-qualified, started giving them to countries around. And people loved that. It was vaccine diplomacy. And, the
Yeah.
president, was getting attention. And then, lo and behold, when the Delta epidemic hit India, and we saw those horrible pictures of funeral pyres burning everywhere, the opposition said, "Well, look, here's the prime minister giving out, vaccines to all these people that were Indian vaccines," and they never stopped the export officially. But all of a sudden, there was no export at all, and that, as you said, led us to be about closer to 600 million doses
Yeah.
short. And that's one of the reasons there were such terrible delays. But one statistic, just to finish before we go back to the next question, is at the end, 57% of people in the poorest 92 countries received a primary dose. That compared to about 67% globally. So it wasn't quite equitable. But also there is more high-risk populations in places that have more elderly populations, et cetera. So we don't know what that number exactly should be, but it was very delayed, which is the problem. But ultimately, we were able to get very high coverage, which is, I think, a big positive of this effort.
No, I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, it's just how you did this. And this is a story that, I think a lot of people, and certainly people listening, would not be familiar with. I mean, people know about OWS, Operation Warp Speed, but here on the global front, this one, it started earlier than OWS and it achieved a grand impact throughout the world. So, just amazing, despite all obstacles. Now, let's go to vaccines. They've saved about 500 million lives over the years. Every 200 children get a vaccine, it saves each one life. It's amazing statistics, right?
That's for
Right.
the malaria vaccine, particularly. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so today there's a paper on tuberculosis mRNA vaccine. We've made big progress with malaria, all these other pathogens that have been going for decades without a vaccine. So we are in the face of anti-vaccine. We are seeing the withdrawal of support for mRNA, which has implications well beyond, as you well know, infectious disease, for cancer and autoimmune diseases, genome editing for rare diseases, and on and on. And so we have things that don't make any sense. They're irrational. Can you help frame all this?
well, I can frame it, but I certainly can't make it make sense because it makes no sense.
Yeah.
Just to say that the progress on vaccines has been extraordinary. So we went from having 6 basic vaccines to having vaccines against the largest killers of children, diarrhea and pneumonia. We began to have vaccines against common cancers. So we rolled out in China, for example, a vaccine against liver cancer. They had 350,000 cases a year of this disease, and you can't do liver transplants in those days, for that population. So terrible death rates from hepatitis B, where there was transmission, and cervical cancer. Again, we're in the process of rolling that out worldwide to get women, because this is in many countries the largest cancer killer of women, and now parasitic diseases. And to your point, we're beginning to now have vaccines against prime or tumor antigens. And so, we're going to have immunotherapy for cancers and prevention for cancers and prevention for other infectious diseases that antecede, and we'll have vaccines, I predict, also for chronic diseases and immune diseases, et cetera. So a lot of stuff is happening. Now, meanwhile, we have 2 different problems. We have vaccine hesitancy, and that's existed from the beginning. Smallpox time, they had a woodcut with people having cows' horns growing out of their heads because it came from cows. And there's always been misinformation, and the difference, by the way, between misinformation is what Polly might say and not knowing what she's talking about, and you can correct that with knowledge. Disinformation is somebody intentionally putting out
Right.
information,
Right.
and that is a big problem now. But on top of that, we have this politicization where we've had more. For example, Republicans per capita die in the US during the COVID pandemic because of not getting vaccinated. And, again, the vaccine shouldn't be political. They should be based upon your risk and getting them for everyone. So this has become a huge problem going forward. The mRNA story is a crazy one because if you believe fundamentally that the mRNA isn't safe enough, and by the way, we've had now billions and billions of
Oh,
observation points
yeah.
because it's been
Yeah.
used everywhere in the world. But if you believe that, what we do in science is we do more research. We do following what's happening there, and that would be the right solution. But instead, what we've done is pulled the research. We've pulled out the efforts that are on that. And the truth is, maybe someday we'll have something better. But today, if we had another pandemic, and maybe it wouldn't be 1.5% mortality rate, we have pathogens that are 30, 40, 50% mortality rate. Every minute counts in those moments to try to move towards something, and nothing is as fast as mRNA. So in this case, we had not used mRNA before. It's not licensed, so people were slower than it could be. But if I remember the numbers correctly, we had it from the time the genome was published. We had it in 42 days in a vial and 63 days the first injection. And
Yeah.
that could now be compressed down. There is nothing else can move at that speed. So I don't know about what the policymakers are thinking, but I want that in my armamentarium, and I want to optimize it as best as possible. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
China is shooting ahead now,
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
optimize this and move this forward, as are now some other countries.
Well, there's so much to talk about on the mRNA front. I mean, I wrote a Substack about how this recent paper, extraordinary, that only the mRNA vaccines with uh, people with cancer rev up immunotherapy by
Yep.
stimulating interferon, not seen with the non-mRNA vaccines, so that people that got these shots along the way with COVID who had cancer had a huge benefit that otherwise wouldn't have been realized. So there's benefits, but what gets me, Seth, is that we have sat stagnant. We know these mRNA vaccines could be better. The nanoparticles can be improved.
Yep.
There's some amplifying mRNA
Yep.
vaccines in Japan that are approved, but we've done nothing to make these better. We just if frozen from 2020. Why don't we
But that's
see?
all. That's all politics. I mean, and
Yeah,
that's my
yeah,
point. Is
yeah.
if you just had the worst pandemic in the last 100 years, which we did, what should be the reaction? Okay, I understand. After the 1918 pandemic, people said, I don't want to talk about flu anymore, et cetera. But we didn't have the same science then. What should be the reaction? Okay, people don't have to talk about it, but the science community should be funded to make, for example, universal coronavirus vaccines.
Right.
And they should be optimizing the technology. As you wrote in your book, Super Agers, one of the challenges with mRNA vaccines is they didn't seem to have really long duration of protection. This is a solvable problem. It just
Yep.
takes some more research and some more design work, et cetera. And so we should have continued that work, continued the investment to get us to a place where we had these tools, because frankly, COVID is still around. It's still causing deaths. And we could have a strain that appears of either COVID-19 that is much more a disease causing and may escape from some of the protection, or we could have another coronavirus pop out of a bat somewhere in the world. And so why we're not doing this just seems to me to be crazy. And the last point I'd make on this is I just wrote a paper a couple of days ago, and I made this observation: we're cutting global health, we're cutting health investments. And at the same time, we're increasing defense investments. So we're talking about a 12% increase to $1 trillion. I can't comment on whether that's a good use of money or not. But if you ask the question, and this is a little apples and oranges, but it just puts it into perspective, how many Americans died during COVID? So more Americans died during COVID than died in all wars after the Civil War till today. So when you start talking about security, you can't have security without global health security. And today, with synthetic biology and AI, we are at enormous risk, not just for naturally occurring infections or laboratory accidents, but also for bioterrorism. It will happen. We're overdue for it. And again, the same preparations are going to need to be there to make vaccines quickly, to have distribution system, to have surveillance systems. So we should be preparing for that. And instead, we're just pulling away from it, which seems just stupid.
It really is. And I mean, I can't fathom it because we talked about the mRNA in particular that could be made so much better even than what
Yes.
we already saw. We haven't seen the non-shot world develop like patches and nasal
Yep.
vaccine. I
Yep.
mean, nasal vaccines have so much promise, but and of course it would be a lot easier to get out distributing for mass use. Now, we're going to have another pandemic, as you say. We still could face another Omicron-like event, even with this virus.
Yep.
But as you say, it could be influenza, it could be another coronavirus, and many other viruses on the list here that could do us in. And we're doing nothing. We've eliminated this administration, the pandemic preparedness uh, entity, and you're basically taking out
We
any
kneecapped
support.
CDC. I mean, completely, you know.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna talk tomorrow, with Susan Moneris, the first live interview after, her rapid, tenure of 39 days at CDC with the gutting of one-third of the workforce of
Yep.
CDC, no less the budget. So I'll talk to her about it, but obviously, you have a lot of insight here too. We are seeing just the opposite of what we would be thinking would be rational. That what we went through, this horrendous, a century worst pandemic, and learning nothing from it. And
Yes.
all the success that we've seen, like what you had with COVAX, Operation Warp Speed, we should be building on it. And it's incredible to me. I must be frustrating to you, but how do you deal with the frustration?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you got to keep moving forward, and so I'm proselytizing for people to understand why this is important and to ultimately make changes. Because at the end, if we had one of these worst pandemics, and by the way, I believe we're entering an era of polyepidemics. Why do I believe that? We've got still increasing populations worldwide. I know that's going to slow down, but we've also got intense urbanization. We've got climate change refugees that are moving. We're going to have climate disasters. We're having vectors of disease that are now moving into new areas. So we're going to see more and more outbreaks and pandemics, in the future, and therefore this stuff becomes even more important than it was
Yeah.
before. And the other thing about this, Eric, is if you go back in time, the natural death rate without any interventions is about 350 per thousand children. That's what it was back before we had all these interventions. And, clean water and sanitation made a big difference, better housing, a bunch of things, but vaccines really were the big thing that have driven that down. And now here in the US, it's about 5 per thousand. Gone from 350 deaths per thousand to 5 per thousand. But the best places in the world are around zero point 0.9 per thousand.
Mhm, mhm.
And as a society, what we should be doing is making no parent have to lose a child or have a child with, disabilities because of infections that we can prevent. And so, again, I just don't understand the logic on the routine side as well, not just on the pandemic side of demonizing MMR vaccines, of pulling away from existing antigens, of talking about not giving them in the recommended dose schedules. These are all things that are going to have an effect. And by the way, if the rest of the world has these diseases raging because we've cut our development aid, then that increased the risks of importations back in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has eliminated measles, 2000, eliminated measles, the big outbreak we have now, the largest since 2000, because somebody brought it back in. And if we now have polio running, wild
Mhm.
again, and measles and diphtheria and pertussis, that is going to come back and have an effect on us. So we ought to do it because it's the right thing, but we ought to do it for self-protection as well.
Well, for your mental health, by being living in Geneva, Switzerland, does that help you? Because knowing that at least the country there is working, unlike the one here.
It's not helpful because I care so much about the world, and the effects right now on the world are so dramatic. I mean,
Yeah,
the fact that the U.S. walked away from funding Gavi because of some crazy conspiracy theory, not for any valid reason. There's going to be 75 million less kids vaccinated, and there's estimated to be another 1.2 million kids may die from this. I mean, again, is that what we should be doing? So, yes, there is the rule of law in Switzerland. Yes, there is a attention to science and respect for academia and
yeah,
expertise,
yeah.
but we need to get that back across the world.
Well, I mean, I know you think globally, but at least from a day-to-day standpoint, you're in a land that is functioning by the old ways of respecting data, evidence, science, and the power of vaccines, the most
Yes,
important
that's right.
tool we have in all of public health.
I'm in
So,
Boston right now, though, so
yeah,
where the first public health department was, and where I worked years ago in the state, epidemiology department, among other places, and taught at the Harvard School of Public Health. So, you know,
it's a familiar grounds for you. Now, you led Gavi for 12 years and obviously culminated in this COVAX effort. Um, then you decided to move on, I guess. Was there anything about the move from leading Gavi that, or was just 12 years enough, or what were your thoughts about that one?
So, in general, these types of jobs are desirable because it's a big international job, and I went there to do 3 years actually originally,
Oh,
and then they liked me and they said, "We want to show you we like you. Can you do 4 years?" And then they liked me and did another 4 years. And then they finally said, well, it's COVID and all of that. Maybe you can do another year. But I think at that point it was, I had done my service, and it's an amazing organization. It vaccinated more than 1.2 billion additional children, introduced more than 700 novel vaccines, contributed to this effect of a 70% reduction in vaccine preventable diseases, which contributed to the 50% reduction in under five child mortality. So I love the organization. I still do. But its goal is to just help countries. It's not really charity. It's, the poorest countries, they pay something for the doses, but just a little. We work to drive the prices down. We work to help them get vaccines out, to help build their systems. And over time, as they get richer, they pay more and more until they graduate out of Gavi. So it's some of the best type of development aid. And it's interesting because, as I said, the U.S. administration has stopped funding it now. But during the first administration of the Trump administration, they actually give Gavi a 5% increase because they said this
mm,
is exactly the type of development aid we should be doing. It helps protect Americans by controlling disease. It helps countries, have a step up, instead of charity. It allows them to then take over the costs. And U.S. was one of many funders. It wasn't carrying, an unproportional burden. So I just don't understand. And this is the problem when you put people in leadership roles who have fixed, idée fixe on these issues and come in with bias against them rather than trying to drive forward using the best science. And science is all we have when we deal with epidemics and pandemics. It may change during it. We may learn new things, but if we can't trust science, then what can we trust? It can't be the biggest influencers on social media because they're not going to have the knowledge and wisdom to move forward.
yeah. So there's another part of what we're trying to probe here about why that we get into this situation where we're not going to be prepared unless something drastic shakes things up as we stand right now. And one of those, of course, is denialism. That is, you know, after going through what this horrific pandemic for years, it's just like who needs to deal with it anymore? Just denying that there's even the virus out there. That although it's just a cold. I mean, this kind of stuff. Even though that we got hundreds of people dying every week.
And long-term effects that I mean, you've
Oh
written
yeah,
about this, and the effects of getting COVID on your cardiovascular system, on your renal system, on your neurologic system. It's not just a cold, and
absolutely.
obviously, we want to try to avoid that. That's why we need better vaccines. By the way, we need vaccines to prevent infection, not just mitigate disease, and that's why the research should be screaming ahead right now rather than being pulled back.
And that's what I wanted to get into is if we weren't in this denial mode. And by the way, we did just start a very large, the largest yet, long COVID trial with tirzepatide last week, and we've had incredible interest in enrollment. It's 1,000 participant trial. I think we had half as many of the 1,000 in the first couple of few days. So
Wow.
great, there's great interest in getting a treatment for long COVID, and obviously even better would be preventing it, which we're not doing. But this universal vaccine is the other topic I wanted to discuss with you. Over the course of the pandemic, maybe 25 different academic institutions came up with ways to develop a universal vaccine. That is coming up with whether it's cryptic antigens or various strategies, even with fostering T cell immunity, whatever. And these have not gone forward in any significant way. No less the nasal vaccines, of which there have been many, again, by academic labs like Washington University that sold the license out to India, and many others too, Emory, Yale. So we have the brain power to come up with much better vaccines. But unlike what you did in COVAX or Operation Warp Speed, finding the funding when there was none, and developing this. Is there any chance that all this great science that's been published on from great labs throughout the world that we're actually going to act on this?
I mean, you open up exactly what the problem is, and I'm here in Boston in Flagship Pioneering. I'm executive vice chair of a company called A Priori Bio. They actually, were one of the companies that actually made a solution for COVID. They were able to produce vaccines that were looking using AI and machine learning to where the virus was going, predicting
Right,
what
right.
mutations could occur, what would structurally work, and then producing antigens that would cover those in the future. So you could make vaccines that were at least starting with a couple of years of coverage, and you could make extra vaccines for things that might come in the future. So you have them structurally made. There's no interest in COVID. So, it's shifted over now to doing the same thing in flu and doing that on H5. And even on H5, again, they pulled out despite the fact that it was in California, it was national, it was a state emergency. I mean, 20% of the milk at one point was infected with virus. And
Oh, but we should
we're
drink raw milk, right? Yeah.
yes, no, but this is the point. So we're not investing in these, and the environment. The problem is that when the government and you have to understand from an investor point of view, people are saying, okay, well, I don't know what the return's going to be because people don't care about this. But the other side of it is you got to get these things through regulatory agencies, and if the regulatory agencies are hostile to technologies like mRNA, et cetera, then you may have delays, which delays in biotech is money. So you've got academic investigators really doing exciting work. Those need to be converted into, trying to turn it into real products. And there's not a lot of appetite right now for that. And, in the area of AI crossover, there is some interest because, of course, there's a lot of funding available for AI. And you can do really amazing things, AI for good, by using it for these types of technologies. But even then, you still have to turn them into vaccine products and and
Yeah.
and you know and mucosal vaccines, the same thing. I mean, the barrier is potentially high on the regulatory side, but we need to work through that. And today with AI, you can begin to do much better predictions of what's happening. You can understand toxicities in silico. You can begin to drive towards having really understanding exactly what you're doing. And let's just remind people that the reason we had COVID vaccines in 327 days was because we had 20 years of research on mRNA
Yeah.
vaccines, and we had research on two previous COVID vaccines. We had not COVID, sorry, coronavirus vaccines.
Coronavirus,
We
right?
had MERS and we had SARS, and those vaccines, vaccines were built. People solve the problem of how to get a spike protein, how to stabilize it, how to do all that. So when the pandemic hit, people knew exactly what to do. And that's why the yield wasn't 7%, as you said before, on the success rate for new vaccines. Most of the vaccines ended up working because we had all that science basis. So when we kill basic science, this is a real problem. You won't feel it today, but you will feel it in the future. And if we don't have young people going into science, how are we going to create the next generation for this? So I don't see how that makes America healthy again or makes America great again. And it seems to me we ought to be doubling down on the great academic institutions, the great, scientists we have, and supporting that research as an engine. Because if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. We're all going to get older. Lifespan is, as you describe in Super Ages, lifespan is going to increase. We're going to need new innovations, and so we ought to be investing in that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, just to touch on that mucosal nasal vaccine or oral vaccine, this is so promising, all the data that we have. And yet, this is not, this was dropped by the current administration. The money that was coming through BARDA and other sources that was put together to support both nasal and universal vaccines. So we just abandoned it. Whereas we need to block infections. And that's, of course, the biggest. All these people that are anti-vaccine because it says COVID vaccine because, oh, it doesn't block infections. Well, yeah, it did really well until we had these variants pop
Yeah.
up. And we could also get back to it doing really well if we were to invest and take the nasal vaccine story forward. Now, the last thing I want to
But
ask
part of
you,
that is
yeah,
part of that is also figuring out how to better understand the immune system, how to understand the stimulation of it, how to measure it in mucosal surfaces and standardize it. How do you measure it in the lung? How do you measure it? So there again are efforts to better understand the immune system, to understand the human immunome, to look at mucosal based knowledge, and that will have effects for what we're just talking about, better vaccines, but it'll have broader effects for understanding, allergens and dealing with, reactive airway disease, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, the important point here is that we don't know where the knowledge will take us. It's 20 years ago, we did the human genome. It's only now that we're really using that knowledge to create therapeutics to do the types of interventions we're talking about.
no, I couldn't agree with you more about that. I mean, we need this human immunome work. There's a project that started at Yale, but it doesn't have that much funding. But to understand this complex system, we're going to start to see in the beginning of next year these so-called immune system clocks that will tell us the pace of a
Yep.
person's immune system aging, which is important in people who are older, just because some of them are immunosenescent already. And it's good to know that, especially when you're giving them a vaccine and you're hoping they're going to work really well, but lots of other reasons as well. So last to close, before I ask you for this one note of optimism, because we got to end with some optimism.
Yep.
I want to say what you did with COVAX is just, it's so beyond belief. And a lot of people don't know the story. Fair doses is really a way to tell a story that is just quite extraordinary. For those who really want to know what happened here, all the ins and outs, the inside story, if you will, who came together, how it all worked, all the obstacles. I couldn't recommend the book more. So, Seth, can you leave us with some type of optimistic note as we finish up here?
Yeah, I mean, my optimism comes from science and science and technology, as does yours. And it is amazing the tools. If you had to think and go back at where we were, in fact, in the epilogue of the book, I kind of make this point, because my career is long. Had this outbreak occurred, had this pandemic occur, 40 years ago when I started my career, we wouldn't have any of the tools we needed to be able to do this. I mean, by the way, we didn't talk about the fact that we had to organize the whole bloody campaign and raise the $12.5 billion and work across the world operating virtually, because
Yes.
we
Yeah.
were in lockdown, and so it's not just the tools in biologic science. It was the computational tools. It was video conferencing. It was the internet. It was all of these things came together to give us this. So my optimism is exactly like in your book. We've been on a pathway of better health, longer lifespans, better cognition, hopefully, as people get older, et cetera, et cetera. And we can do better on that, but we're going to have to continue to work on that science. And if we do that, I think, the sky's the limit. I know there's some biological limits, but the goal here is to have a health span. You want people to, you know, live their lives healthy, have no mortality in childhood. You want no chronic diseases, and you want people to die in their sleep when whatever that age is. You know better that than I do, and we want to get as close as we can to that square curve. To me, that's the optimism, and the reason I think it's a problem to ignore health. We've laid all the different reasons, but at the end, when you see the billionaire who all of a sudden gets a bad disease, they'll do anything for trying to restore their health. And what we want is not to restore health. We want to have health be there throughout time. We want to have prevention. And that to me is the most optimistic thing that we can possibly do for families, for parents, for loved ones. And I think we've got a long runway there if we keep at it.
Well, I would just add to your optimism that the human achievement, the potential that you actualize with COVAX and tell the story on fair doses, as we saw with the Operation Warp Speed, we can do big things if we set our
Yep.
mind. And I have to also say that we're in a lull is a nice word right now for what we're going through. It's much worse than that. We will come back. We will see, I hope, a reactive hyperemia of the science of evidence and data to drive great human achievement. And sure, we'll have some help with AI along the way. But that's what I think the story of fair doses tells me, is doing big things for the planet, for the whole, billions of people that inhabit it, when you don't even know that there's a pandemic, when you don't even know there's going to be a vaccine in a year. That's a story that, will go down for the ages. So, Seth, thank you, not just for the book and for, our friendship, but for telling this story and discussing it with us today. I think a lot of people didn't know anything about it. And now we're learning, and hopefully we will get back to, where we were when you launched this, extraordinary effort.
So thank you so much for having me, Eric, and for all that you're doing. And let's continue to drive all the listeners that are going to listen to this. Help us drive forward to a return to science and truth and trust, because these are the things we need.
We will get there someday. I'm sure of it. Thanks so much, Seth.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for joining. And please join tomorrow with Susan Monera's her first live exclusive interview about her tenure at the CDC.